What if a simple itch on your body was not just irritation, but a deadly warning sign? For tiny spots that seem harmless could actually reveal hidden dangers that silently shorten life after 60. Stay with me, because once you hear this story, you will never ignore an itch the same way again. The old man sat by the window, staring at the quiet street below. The evening light fell across his wrinkled hands, and he rubbed at a small itch just above his collarbone. At first, it seemed harmless, just a tiny irritation that faded as quickly as it came. But the sensation returned, sharper, hotter, as if something beneath the skin was clawing to break free. He shifted uneasily in his chair, pressing his fingers against the spot until his skin turned red. Then another itch sparked at the back of his ear, a dull, crawling burn that spread in a circle. The air felt heavy, thick, as if the room itself was pressing against his chest. He reached for a glass of water, but his hand trembled and nearly knocked it over. His breath caught when he noticed a third spot itching along his side, just above his ribs. It was no longer mild. It was fierce, relentless, a fire trapped under the surface. Each spot seemed to pulse with its own rhythm, like tiny hidden heartbeats inside his skin. He closed his eyes, trying to ignore it, but the thought pierced his mind like a whisper he could not escape. What if these were not just harmless itches? What if his body was warning him of something darker, something that waited silently after 60? The fourth itch began at his leg, just below the knee. It spread upward, slow, steady, with a heat that made him grip the edge of the chair until his knuckles whitened. He opened his eyes and saw his reflection in the darkened window. His face was pale, his lips drawn tight, and the flicker of fear in his eyes was unmistakable. The house around him grew silent. Even the ticking of the clock seemed to fade. He touched each spot one by one, and with every press of his fingertips, the sensation grew stronger, almost alive. It was then he realized something was terribly wrong. The old man leaned forward, his breath shallow, as if the air in the room had turned too thin to fill his lungs. He ran his hand across the collarbone again, tracing the heat beneath his skin, and a shiver traveled up his spine. The itch was not random. It was deliberate, as if each spot had chosen its place with grim precision. His chest tightened with the thought, and his mind darted back to the faded words of a pamphlet he once skimmed in the clinic waiting room. It had warned of subtle signs, little irritations that were not just skin deep, but signals of hidden dangers lurking within the body. He had dismissed it then, thinking such warnings were only meant to frighten. But now, with four burning spots alive upon his body, he wondered if those words had been more than idle warnings. The silence in the room pressed harder, and his eyes flicked toward the dark corners of the ceiling, where shadows seemed to gather and sway. The itch behind his ear throbbed, as if echoing a pulse that was not his own. He pressed harder, nails scraping his own skin until it stung, yet the sensation only deepened. His ribs ached where the third spot had appeared, and the itch there was sharper than the rest. Each breath drew pain, subtle but undeniable, like a reminder that something within him was unraveling. The glass of water still trembled on the table, half full, the surface rippling with each shaky movement of his hands. He reached for it again, and this time the glass tipped, spilling across the wood, dripping to the floor in slow, uneven streams. The sound of the drops striking the ground seemed louder than it should have been. His eyes darted to the window. Beyond the glass, the streetlights glowed, but their light flickered as if unseen hands were tampering with the wires. He whispered under his breath, a question not meant for anyone in particular. Why here? Why now? The words faded quickly, swallowed by the thick air. He pushed himself up from the chair, his knees trembling, his body heavier than it had ever felt. Each step toward the hallway felt longer than the last, as if the house itself resisted his movement. His hand trailed along the wall for balance, his fingertips brushing against the old wallpaper. The patterns blurred in his vision, twisting into shapes that looked like eyes staring back at him. He paused, pressing his forehead to the cool plaster, willing himself to breathe. But the fourth itch, the one on his leg, spread higher, creeping up his thigh with slow, deliberate insistence. He gasped, not from pain, but from the dreadful recognition that this was not an ordinary itch. It was a sign, Something deep within him stirred, something that had waited quietly until his years stacked beyond 60. A memory returned unbidden. An old neighbor, pale and gaunt, had once spoken of similar marks, of restless skin that never stopped burning. Weeks later, that man was gone, his house emptied, his belongings scattered to strangers. The old man had not thought of him in years, yet now the memory struck like a bell. He staggered into the dim hallway, and the floorboards creaked beneath his weight. The silence was broken only by that hollow sound, stretching and echoing like a warning drum. The air seemed colder here, carrying a faint metallic tang, like the smell of rusted iron. His body begged him to stop, to sit, to surrender, but something inside urged him forward. The itch on his collarbone pulsed, sharper now, and he pressed his palm against it, feeling the irregular beat beneath his skin. It was not the steady rhythm of a heart. It was uneven, jagged, as if something foreign pulsed alongside his own blood. He stumbled into the bathroom, flicking the light switch. The bulb hummed and flared weakly, casting a pale glow that revealed his reflection in the cracked mirror. His face was drawn tight, his eyes sunken, but it was not his reflection that made his breath freeze. It was the marks. Faint, reddish circles had bloomed where the itching burned the most. One at the collarbone, one behind the ear, one on the ribs, and one creeping up the leg. They glowed faintly beneath the skin, as if lit from within. He pressed his fingers against one, and the glow intensified, spreading in thin threads outward, like veins of fire. A wave of nausea rolled through him, and he clutched the sink for balance, his knuckles pale against the porcelain. The house groaned as if settling, but the sound was deeper, more alive, vibrating through the floor and into his bones. His reflection flickered in the glass, distorting, bending, as though the mirror itself resisted showing him the truth. The itch behind his ear burned fiercest of all, and a ringing sound filled his head, sharp and high, piercing the silence. He staggered back, gripping his skull, his breaths ragged and shallow. The room spun. The marks pulsed faster now, each beat like a drum in the distance, closer and closer, pressing against his very skin. The truth clawed at his mind, unwelcome yet undeniable. These were not random irritations. They were warnings carved into his flesh, signals of something advancing within him, something that knew his age, his frailty, his place in the long march of time. He stared at the mirror once more, but this time, the reflection stared back with eyes that were not entirely his own, eyes that glowed faintly, echoing the light of the marks. His throat tightened, and he staggered to the doorway, gripping the frame for support. The silence of the house was gone now. A low hum filled the air, deep and steady, vibrating through the walls and into his chest. It was not coming from outside. It was rising from within him, and with every beat, with every surge of heat beneath his skin, he felt the dreadful certainty that his time was unraveling. The 4 marks were not just warnings. They were a countdown, and the last of the numbers was beginning to fade. His hand trembled against the doorframe as the humming inside his body grew louder, drowning out even the faint sounds of the night beyond the window. It was no longer just an itch. It was a vibration, a force coursing through his veins, shaking him from the inside out. The glow beneath his skin pulsed with an almost mechanical rhythm, each flash of red searing against the dim light of the hallway. He tried to speak, to call out, but his throat locked tight, words trapped behind a wall of air that refused to move. His chest tightened, the mark on his ribs throbbed violently, and he doubled over, gripping himself as a sharp pain shot through his side, like a blade twisting deeper and deeper. He staggered back into the living room, crashing into the edge of the chair he had left behind. The shadows in the corners seemed thicker now, alive, watching. The hum merged with the silence, creating a soundless roar inside his head. He pressed his hands to his ears, desperate to block it out, but the vibration only intensified, spreading from his skull to the tips of his fingers. His skin tingled with fire, and every mark blazed brighter, their glow painting the room with sickly, unnatural light. He stumbled toward the window, hoping for air, for a break from the crushing weight of his own body. But as he looked out, the street was gone. The houses, the lamps, the trees, all drowned in darkness, swallowed by something that bent the world into emptiness. Only his reflection remained, staring back through the glass. But it was not as alone anymore. In that reflection, his body was webbed with glowing lines spreading outward from the 4 spots, like roots from a poison tree. And behind his own face, another faint outline emerged, darker, sharper, as if something else had been waiting behind his features, using him as a mask. His heart pounded against his chest, irregular and weak. The glow at his collarbone flared, then split into branching lines that climbed toward his neck. He gasped, clawing at his skin, but his fingers met only heat, a fever that burned from the inside out. The ringing in his ears built higher, higher, until it was no longer sound but a piercing sensation that cut through his mind like glass. He dropped to his knees, the wooden floor cold beneath him. His breath rasped in shallow bursts, every inhale a struggle, every exhale a surrender. He thought of the years that had passed quietly, unnoticed, slipping through his fingers. He thought of the warnings he had ignored, the signs brushed aside as simple discomforts of age. But now, each of those years seemed to gather here, in this moment, pressing down on him with unbearable weight. The glow reached his throat, and his vision blurred. He raised his head one final time toward the window, toward the reflection that no longer belonged entirely to him. And in that flickering image, he saw the truth. The marks were not only warnings. They were the seals of something long hidden, now breaking free. And his body was the vessel it had chosen to escape. The old man's body shuddered, the glow of the 4 marks pulsing one last time, brighter than any flame. His breath rattled in his chest, shallow, uneven, each exhale carrying the weight of years pressed into seconds. The hum within him reached its peak, then faltered, breaking into silence so heavy it seemed to swallow the world around him. The burning under his skin faded. The marks dimmed, their light thinning into faint outlines before vanishing altogether. For a moment, there was only stillness. The old man sat slumped by the window, his hand resting weakly against the glass. Outside, the street returned, quiet houses, steady lamps, the faint rustle of trees, swaying in the night breeze. The reflection staring back at him was once again his own, pale and weary, but undeniably human. He closed his eyes, a single tear trailing down the lines of his face. Perhaps it had only been a warning. Perhaps the body whispered its secrets in strange ways, marking the skin with signs too easily ignored. The weight in his chest eased, and he drew a long, steady breath. The night held him in its quiet arms, and for the first time, the silence felt gentle rather than suffocating. The 4 itchy spots were gone, but the memory of them lingered like a shadow, reminding him, and perhaps anyone who might listen, that the smallest signs should never be forgotten. Because sometimes survival begins with noticing what the body is trying to say. And sometimes it is the difference between fading away in silence or finding one more dawn.